Let's get started. It's now, 11 o'clock? You should have recovered from the party by now, right? So everybody's back awake, got enough caffeine in you. My name's James Ferguson. I'm on the platform product management team. This is now my 9th Dreamforce, so it is incredible how you guys keep coming back, keep making it bigger, better than ever. I'm here today to talk to you about new features that are coming out. Specifically right now, Async SOQL, and it's part of how we're bringing big data into the Salesforce platform and how we can bring that big data processing into the Salesforce platform. So fundamentally, the challenge that you have, the challenge that we see you having, is that there is more and more data, right? You have more customers. Knock on wood, every year you've got more customers. You're collecting more data about your customers because the data is available. Maybe it's clickstream traffic, maybe it's email marketing, maybe it's sensor data, maybe it's point of sale data, maybe it's order and order line item data. You all want to capture that and make it available within your Salesforce instance. So there's more data, and you want to keep it for longer. Maybe you're in a regulated industry, and so you need to keep it for compliance. Maybe you're not, you just want to be able to do historical trending, and you want to be able to look back at what that customer was doing 3 years ago, 5 years ago, compared to what they're doing now, and use that both to project and to provide better service. And when you add all of these together, you end up with this multiplier effect where all of a sudden, instead of having thousands or millions or tens of millions, you can start getting hundreds of millions of records or a billion records. And this is a fundamentally different problem that needs different tools to solve. And that's where big data comes in. Now, big data has traditionally been hard, right? It takes dedicated infrastructure. It takes people to manage that infrastructure and resources to that infrastructure. You need to then tie that infrastructure into your Salesforce instance. All of that is both work. It's work that requires highly trained, meaning expensive resources to do. And that integration and that infrastructure isn't adding value to your business. It is simply providing plumbing that once you do that, then you can generate value. And so one of the things that we do at Salesforce, and we're doing in this case, is really providing that infrastructure for you and integrating that infrastructure for you. So now we can take anybody who knows about custom objects and custom fields and SOQL queries and field level security within the Salesforce platform and bring that to bear on top of a big data infrastructure. So there is no longer that learning curve of, how do I write a MapReduce job? God forbid anybody actually has to write a MapReduce job in their life. I am proud to say that I don't want to, and yet with Async SOQL, I'm effectively doing that, and we'll show you. What are some of the use cases that we see customers, just briefly, customers looking to do? There's a clear value in extending the customer 360 to high volume data. Maybe it's point of sale data. Maybe it's large scale transactional line item, order item detail. We have internal customers using big objects in Async SOQL for marketing engagement history, capturing every email send, every email click, every website visit, capturing so it can then be integrated with contacts and leads. Audit and tracking is one of the first use cases we had for big objects. Maintaining the long tail of changes. Things like CDC events that if you were here talking about Alexi, capturing that for long-term storage. And then finally there's historical archive. There is times where you just want to move data out of your core custom objects and your core standard objects, but maintain them available and online for access. All of these things deal with tens of millions, hundreds of millions of records that would otherwise be impossible without tools like Async SOQL. So let's take a look at a very simple scenario that I've got a demo. That's pretty much the end of my slides. I'm going to be mostly demo. And so let's take a look at this very simple case, right? I've got a standard object, the order object, and I built out this big object for line items. And so let's take a look at what that looks like, if I can bring this up. So here we have our standard order objects, right? And so I can click in, everybody is using Lightning, right? Everybody wants to use Lightning, right? Everybody's going to be using Lightning, right? So we've got our standard order item here, and then I can bring up a list of related list, or order line items that's coming out of this big object, right? Now I will admit that one of my challenges in demonstrating these things is we've built big objects and we've built async SOQL to look a lot like custom objects and regular SOQL. So this sort of looks like a regular custom object that you might have, a regular related list that you might have. What is different is a very important element. Now, how many people know the storage usage page within the setup environment, right? How many people love this page? I don't know about you, this happens to be one of my favorite pages. It's just the way I am. But you can see we've got some pretty straightforward things. We've got 850,000 accounts. You know, not too much, decent number of accounts. For that, I've generated for this demo 10 million orders. Also a decent amount. How many people watch Silicon Valley? Silicon Valley? Well, one of the things that Silicon Valley introduced me to was the 3 comma club, right? And so when I look at this big object with the order line items, I've now got a number with 3 commas in it, right? So it's 1 billion records. I've got over 1 billion records in this big object, in this order line item big object. And yet I can still go and I can browse around, I can pick a different order, I can go bring up its line items, and it comes back in effectively real time, right? And so it can bring back and it can populate this. Now, I'm not going to go into too much about big objects. I've got another session tomorrow that focuses on big objects. But let's suffice it to say that this big object has been designed to support this synchronous query. So I can bring up all the line items for a given order very quickly. But as with any sort of real object within the system, it's not really just about an order and a line item. There are other things, right? This line item is also associated with a product. This line item, the order has a date on it, and the order is also related to a specific account. And if I want to start leveraging this big object data for those, I need to do something that processes 1 billion records, right? I need to have a model of processing against this. I can't use a regular SOQL query, because what would happen if you did a regular SOQL query over 1 billion records? Anyone? Anyone? Right? It's going to time out. What about batch Apex, right? Batch Apex, we cap at 50 million records, right? So we're not going to execute over 1 billion records. We need to have a place where we can do this, and yet we can know it will finish. And so let's take a look at some examples of what we might do with this kind of process. Again, our goal has been to do this in a way that you already understand, right? This is not, it just so happens it's using a bunch of fancy cool kid technologies under the covers, but this is all capabilities that you know as a Salesforce developer, right? This query is a query that I think any of you could write. You know, we're just simply summing a few custom fields. And actually I noticed a typo in here, so let me just fix that, because the field's actually total price, and I need to not fat finger it. A simple aggregate query, right? Grouping by product. Now this is something that I can take, and I can go into WorkBench. And we have this new API, and I will log into WorkBench, because we always have to log in. And I can go, and we now have extended WorkBench to include async SOQL. And so I can go, it's very similar to how you might do a SOQL query, right? You can pull up, you can see the fields, I've got total price, I've got quantity for this individual line item. In this case, I'm going to cheat, and I'm going to just copy and paste. And so here I've got this SOQL query that you know and love. Now, in normal case, in normal WorkBench, you would simply hit query, and you'd sit there and you'd wait for the return result. But we know you aren't going to be effectively scanning over all 1 billion records of this while you wait. And so this is inherently an asynchronous process. Perhaps a giveaway is, we called it async SOQL, right? It's asynchronous. So instead of just firing it, we're going to take this and we're going to tell it where to put the results, right? And so now I need a target object in here, And maybe I've got one in here called, somewhere down here, I've got it called product sales summary, right? And I can now map the different fields. I want the quantity, this alias Q, the quantity sold, this total price into total revenue. The product is going to be this. And now what this will do is it will turn this query really into a MapReduce job and execute it across the cluster. It's going to take too long to run in the demo because it usually takes 10, 15 minutes depending on the query, perhaps longer. But it will take the result set that it generates and it will create new records into this custom object, product sales underscore summary. Which is interesting, right? And we can do that. But what we might want to do is, or we have a challenge, if I run this twice, I'm going to insert new records, right? For the same product. So now I'll start having duplicates. And I don't really like duplicates. I could go through some process of purging it and rewriting it or whatever, but that's not going to be as friendly as what we want. And so what we support with Async SOQL is two forms. One is we can just generate a set of results and just push it into a custom object, and you can do what you want with that custom object. But we also, Salesforce generously over the years have provided things like upsert, right? And now we can, now actually I will just go back because I need a slightly different. Upsert requires you to have, upsert requires required fields. Required fields. I guess that makes sense. And so one of the required fields on the product is the name field. So we also need to be able to insert the name field, and let's group by the name field. Now you see what we're doing here. This big order item has a relationship to product in this product. And how do we reference relationship fields within SOQL? Instead of product underscore C, which gives you the ID, we've got the underscore R, which I realize I've forgotten an underscore. Underscore R, which gives the relationship. And from that relationship, we can now fetch the name of that product. So we can use the name, not just the ID. All concepts you're very familiar with as part of SOQL, right? So now I can take that, and instead of inserting, I can upsert directly into the product to field. In this case, I'm upserting just based on ID, so I can do that. I can, again, map my quantity. I can map my total revenue. In this case, the product's being mapped to the ID because I'm going directly into the product, and the name is mapped to the name. So now I can generate, I could submit this. This would take about 15, 20 minutes in order to process. And what you'd end up with is effectively this number stamped right on the record, right? So now we're able to take this billion records of data, process it, aggregate into, I think I've got about 2,500 products. So take that billion records, which is a fairly unwieldy amount of data, a fairly unwieldy thing, synthesize it, aggregate it down to the 2,500 records that make sense, and display it right within the standard object in this case, or you might have a custom object, right? So this is one case where you can use Async SOQL to take that billion record data and generate useful data, because because it's needed in this case. Let's take another example. We also might want to see the total amount of revenue sold is interesting, right? It's a good number to have. Over the years, it becomes less and less meaningful because what you want is more, how has it been changing over time, right? So again, we can leverage SOQL to do that, and we can take things like this query, again, a standard SOQL query that you know and love. You can now summarize it. Now, instead of just grouping it by product, I can take this date that's stamped on the order, and I can do a calendar year, I can do a calendar month, and I can take that, take those values and group it by that. So now I'll get the summary aggregates, the summary statistics by year and by month. So again, if we cheat and do some copy pasting here, and I can go back to WorkBench, start again here. I have, again, the same query. You can see this time with year and month. And again, I could say I've got another custom object here. I can map quantity, I can map my revenue, I can map my product. I've got fields for year and month as well, so I can do this, all right? So now, again, I could submit this, but again, we're dealing with insert, right? And so insert, if I run it a second time over data from 2 years ago, I'll get duplicate data for that, even though the chances of the order line items changing from 2 years ago is pretty minimal. So what I want to do is upsert it. Now, I have a bit of a challenge, because for upsert in Salesforce, you need an external ID, right? You need to be able to provide an external ID that it will use to match that upsert. And I don't really have one naturally here. Product isn't enough, right? Because we want product by year and by month. And so what we can do with Async SOQL is not just map fields from the queries to fields in the target object, but we can also start doing some string substitution, and we can start doing some, assign some string literals. So I can also do, for example, I can put together what amounts to, let me type first. What amounts to this unique ID, this unique string that represents what I want to upsert into. So there will only be ever one value for 2017 January for a given product. And so I want to use that as my upsert ID. And so now I can stamp that on it. Now if I run this query a second time, it will simply overwrite those values. It will upsert those values. If the data's changed, it'll get an updated value. If the data hasn't changed, it won't get an updated value. But it won't overwrite it, it won't create duplicates. Now what we can do is, once we push this data into this monthly product summary, you can now start using it. Now instead of 1 billion records, we've got, well, I would ask my 10-year-old to do 2,500 times 12 or times 24, but he's at school today, so I can't ask him. Some number, several 100,000 numbers. And now what we can do is, instead of just looking at this aggregate, we can generate a report off these aggregates that are there within this monthly product summary object. And so now I can look over time and see, now this data, this isn't going against the 1 billion records directly, but there's no need for it to go against that 1 billion records directly. We have this ability with Async SOQL to do this aggregation. So if I look at a different product, I can see different charts coming up, and I can pull these charts up. Again, it can be really fast because now I've generated these aggregates in 15, 20 minutes, an hour. Maybe it's a nightly job that does it, and I can generate this data that goes back to January 2016. I want to give one more example, which is now taking that, product is one thing, but I want to leverage these relationships. I want to see what products a given customer may have been ordering across all of their orders. So again, a straightforward SOQL query. None of these queries are things that you wouldn't be able to write yourself. We could support, I'm not doing much filtering here, but you could do filters. You could do group by with halving, so you could only pull out the order, the accounts with more than a given revenue, for example. But all of this stuff is straight SOQL. And I can now take it, I can go back to WorkBench, and I can do my Async SOQL. Again, I can do this, right? So now I've got the same sort of thing, except instead of I'm aggregating it by product and by order by account. So now I'm reaching all the way up effectively to the grandparent of this order line item, all within this Async SOQL job, which is interesting, which means it's combined data from things with standard objects, joining it with things in this big object, and doing processing on it. The end result, I could go through. The end result, I would go through and do an upsert into account. The end result I can do is pull up, I can now look not just at the orders at an individual order, but I could also see all of the products and the aggregation of all of the products that this customer has purchased over the last couple of years. All of this being fed from this 1 billion record data set, but now consumed by Async SOQL to generate these more manageable, usable data sets that can now be surfaced very easily within Lightning, or it will work just as well within Aloha as well. So now that my time is running out, what we have is, where do we go from here? We've got a big objects talk. I'll talk more about big objects when we're there tomorrow at 11:45, just next door over there. This is now, one of the things you did not see from me is a forward-looking statement slide, right? Last year, when I presented this, it was forward-looking. The year before, it was even more forward-looking. We are now GA with Async SOQL. We are now GA with big objects. Big objects, we have a trail and trailhead called Big Object Basics. We have groups in the Trailblazer community where you can open up discussions on this. Big objects are enabled in your org right now. You have 1 million records to play with in the big object data, in big object storage in your org. And then you can expand your capacity and get access to the Async SOQL with either a trial or additional SKU. And so this is stuff that you can now get your hands on immediately. You can work in the dev zone here, or you can take it home and use it immediately. So if you have any questions, I'll be here. Other members of the team are here as well, and we're more than happy to ask questions. Thank you for coming out, and enjoy the rest of Dreamforce.